We've seen the deep southwest. Now we're going up to the far northeast, and some probably would say from the sublime to the ridiculous. But we'll press on. We northern folk up in Moray were caught unawares by the 900th anniversary of David I. We were a little perplexed as to whether we should celebrate or commemorate or just churlishly ignore the whole thing, because the place of David in Scottish history depends on your perspective, and the view from the north urges the title of the paper. Certainly in 1124, the men of Moray had little reason to celebrate the accession of David. After all, Moray had its own king, its own royal families, and an inauguration site of astonishing grandeur at Forres. In 1124, there were still people alive for whom Macbeth was a living memory. Macbeth, who had ruled over a united Moray and Scotland, embracing Scotland into Moray. This had been broken, of course, by Malcolm Canmore, who clambered to the throne over the bodies of two Moravian kings. This was normal enough, as Professor Barrett reminds us. And each new king came to power and was expected to come to power by rebelling against his predecessor and either killing him or having him killed. Killing a king and making a king were two sides of the same political coin. And so to Moray. Moray was a significant territory within the hybrid kingdom of Scotland. Moray preserved its identity as a Gallic recension of the Pictish kingdom of Fortrue, and the boundaries of Fortrue were substantially respected by Anglo-Norman bishops created under Alexander I and by the 14th century earldom. And the province of Moray remained a potent thing even in the 18th century. In the 12th century, Moray's native rulers proved resilient and relentlessly ambitious, while Canmore kings struggled to produce sons who could take the throne under newfangled Anglo-Norman rules of primogeniture. Vigorous Moravian kings combined bloodlines from Moray, Scotia, and the North, from Lulach, from Malcolm Canmore, and from Ingeborg, to produce a stream of eligible princes and princesses. That is, this element of the family tree down here. And the princes of Moray were recognized as kings in Gallic sources. Nonetheless, Anglo-Norman chroniclers characterized the kings of Moray variously as idiots, rebels, and bastards, or downgraded their kingship by redefining them as provincial mormarts. And that's a complicated concept which other heads will have to unpick. Otherwise, Moray's kings were designated mere earls in some kind of treacherous rebellion against the lawful king. This is not how it was seen in Moray. The kings of Moray were canny in their marriages and in their political connections. They formed alliances with sideline Canmore princes. They found safe havens in the north and in Ireland, where they also recruited armies. And in every generation, from the killing of Macbeth in 1057-8 down to the 1220s, successive Moravian princes rose up to claim the kingship of the Scots. The wars of the men of Moray are variously documented, mostly by Canmore apologists. But from this winner's history, we learn that in 1078, King Melsnectar's mother was captured with all of Melsnectar's cattle and treasure. 1085, Melsnectar died happily, probably in monastic captivity, perhaps in the monastery at Deer, which he in fact had endowed. In 1116, Alexander I barely escaped from the ruffians of Moray at Invergowrie and took his revenge on the army of Moray at the Stockford on the Ross frontier, where he earned his surname the Fierce, following up with a harrying of Moray. In 1130, David I's army killed King Angus of Moray at Stracathro with, it was said, 4,000 of his men, and the lordless land was harried again. Angus's estates were confiscated. This was the best land in the North Sea lowlands. thus Angus. In 1150, David made his only visit to the north. He may have been in Moray to assert his kingship with a ceremony at Sweno Stone, the inauguration site of the Moravian kings. He may have been there for the funeral of his kinsman, William, son of Duncan. He may have been there to take possession of Duncan's lands. Whatever happened, the visit was not a triumph. David, it seems, only narrowly escaped an assassination attempt and had to flee to his vassal's castle. In response, David, or perhaps this was the reason for the assassination attempt, began a determined colonial plantation of Moray with Anglo-Norman people and institutions. The conquest of Moray has two faces. First, there's military conquest, and the kings of Moray are killed, native lordships are expropriated. From the time of Alexander I onwards, kings of Scots, who were also feudal lords under Norman kings of England, branded themselves as European-style knights, with all the baggage of Anglo-Norman culture. This is William I, David's grandson. From 1130 onwards, however, Moravian claimants continued to emerge. David's nephew, sometimes heir, William Fitz-Duncan, who held Moray as an earldom, married a Moravian princess whose offspring significantly came to be known as MacWilliams in Gaelic form. And MacWilliam claimants inherited Canmore and Moravian bloodlines, and they fought major battles against David and his successors, against Malcolm IV, who we are told exiled the men of Moray, against William I, burning castles and capturing Aldern in the 1180s, against Alexander II, capturing castles and burning Inverness in the 1220s. This episodic warfare represents one face of the Norman conquest of Moray. The other face is more subtle, more decisive, and it's exemplified by Aelred, who we've heard of before, who says that David I decked thee, the country that is, with castles and towns and with lofty towers. He enriched thy harbours with outlandish wares, gathered together the wealth of other countries for thine enjoyment, and turned thy hairy cloaks into costly garments, covered thy nakedness of old with purple and fine linen. He quelled thy savage ways with Christian piety. This, of course, over-eggs the pudding, but Aelred's eulogy recognises the colonial effort and the broad economic revolution that David initiated in Moray. The pattern and trajectory that David established, relentlessly pursued in the following century, would at last incorporate the troublesome northern kingdom of Moray into the Empire of Scotland. Documentation is patchy, but the process is writ large in the landscape of Moray, and that's what I want to look at. There's a landscape of lordship. Military conquest certainly thinned out the ranks of Moray's native nobility, opening the way for newcomers to take the land of Moray. Estates in Moray were reallocated by David to men he felt he could trust under newfangled feudal tenure. Two Flemings, Freskin and Barrett, held land at either end of Loch Spiny, controlling the sea gate to Moray. Freskin later expanded his empire into Petty, across to Ardmennach, and ultimately up into Sutherland. Freskin's successors called themselves de Moravia, as though they were belted earls, though they had no titles at all. Pollock of Crookston was given Rothes, where he built a large castle. The feudal lord of Ripley in Yorkshire received Dallas, and later Cantray, where he built a motte. Descendants of David's Chancellor, William Comyn, received the lordships in Lochaber, Badenoch and Strathdown, and the last native princess of Buchan was married off to a Comyn who controlled her kingdom as an earldom. Bissets and grants came up from Northamptonshire, David's heartland, to receive lands in Western Moray, chiefly in, oh, we can't go back. No, right. A spur of castles, castle mottes, show the spread of Anglo-Norman culture. This pox of mots across the country defines Anglo-Norman lordship in Moray. Mots controlled the major routes through Moray. They controlled nodal points on those routes, and especially they defined a culture zone in the Lake of Moray, the rich lowlands between the Devon and Ardmennach, the Black Isle. And it's marked by a string of castles which seal the entrances to the straths. This is colonial planning on the large scale. And then there's a church. Political and territorial control was underpinned by reformed ecclesiastical regimes. A bishopric of Moray, created under Alexander I, became fully organised as a managerial bishopric under David, and a patchwork of parishes, partly defined by native lordships and chapelries, was mapped out under David. New churches replaced ancient ecclesiastical sites, such as Kineda, Deer, and Rosemarkie. The parochial clergy inherited the endowments of native patrons, but these were almost immediately appropriated by the bishops of Moray to support the cathedral and cathedral services. New parish churches were built in the Anglo-Norman style. There are no pre-Norman churches in Moray. They were obliterated. The Moray Cathedral eclipsed the old ecclesiastical centre at Kineda, which declined to become a bishop's palace and later a mere parish church. Two new monasteries pinned down David's conquest of the Lake of Moray. Kinloss was a thank offering for the defeat of the men of Moray and for David being spared after the coup of 1150. The second monastery at Urquhart celebrated the killing of Earl Angus. The native monastery of Deer was emasculated as a daughter of Kinloss and ceased to be an independent place. A third monastery at Pluscaden was a thank offering by Alexander II, David's great-grandson, for the killing of the last native princess of Moray, who was an infant of several months old, who was battered to death against the market cross at Forfar, or possibly against the Swedish stone at Forres. Thus, in the 1220s, the trajectory of reform initiated by David was being completed by Alexander when he moved the cathedral from a rather remote site at Spiney to the outskirts of Elgin. He also dignified the borough of Elgin with 2 friaries and a hospital, making Elgin an ecclesiastical capital for the conquered province. The cathedral on the outskirts was the crowning glory of that. But if there's one thing that seems to shout out loud the word conquest, it is the 7 boroughs of Moray. The King's boroughs, created under David I, Banff, Cullen, Elgin, Forres, Auderne, Inverness, and Cromarty, were a new institution in Moray. Borough plantation had begun in Scotia under Alexander I, while David was waiting to become king. In Moray, however, there is a planning and a deliberation in the landscape of the boroughs that seems to shriek conquest. They were deliberately planned. They were placed with meticulous care, and their internal organization was very, very rigorously laid out. I mean, boroughs weren't new. There were boroughs all over England, and they were imported by David into Scotland as a colonial exercise. They were placed in the landscape where they could benefit from a seaside landing place, Loch Spiny, Loch Loy, the estuaries of the Ness, and the Cromarty Firth. Boroughs were spaced so they might enjoy monopolies on trade within a 6 2/3 mile hinterland. This is something that Henry de Bracton in the 14th century defined as the paradigm for borough spacement. But David had already achieved it in the 12th century. These are the 6 2/3 mile hinterlands of the borough, and as you can see, there's barely any overlap. This is planning on the big scale. The boroughs were placed where possible, where there was some place of power. So Forres is on a Moravian royal site. Elgin probably stands on the site where King Duncan's or some of King Duncan's remains were buried. Cromarty was probably placed on a royal thainage of the Moravian kings. And the king's boroughs were populated by carpet-bagging immigrants from across the Anglo-Norman world, from Flanders, from Picardy, from Brittany, from Normandy, from England. The language of trade, the language of the boroughs, was English. The boroughs were an extraordinary innovation. They were conceived as a standard English-style linear town, an urban design already well established. Recently, I've been conducting some research on these, and the planning of the boroughs is quite remarkable in its consistency. There's the Seagate to Moray. There is the Castle of Forres at the one end of the town, and this is where the Moravian kings had their capital, I would suggest. This is Elgin, and this is where Duncan's innards are buried. This is Cromarty. Each borough was dominated by a royal castle about a bow shot from the edge of the town, 220 yards if you actually measure it. This is the Castle Motte at Forres, Castle Motte at Elgin, Castle Motte at Inverness. This is planning. The boroughs were planned along a linear high street. This is not a thoroughfare, this is a destination. This is where the markets were held. This is where foreign trade was landed. Foreign trade from Flanders and Europe. The boroughs were there to create wealth, to create tolls for the king, to create market economies, for which David, of course, created a currency. Though whether any of it ever reached Moray is a moot point. The high streets are pegged out using English measures. Each of the terminal boroughs at Banff and Inverness were 1 furlong long, 220 yards. The terminal boroughs, the boroughs between them were 440 yards long, 2 furlongs. This is precise planning. Each immigrant to the borough occupied a burgess plot with a house that he built end onto the high street. Would not have had doors opening onto the high street. That would have been a shocking innovation. And these plots are precisely measured using English measures. Each burgess paid 5 pence for his plot per annum to the king. That's 5 silver pennies. And the elegance of the plan is that a 2 furlong borough contains 96 plots according to the plan of David's surveyors. And 96 fivepences works out at exactly £2. A £2 bag of silver goes to the king each year. A 1 furlong borough, £1 to the king. And this is the planning that is going into the creation of these boroughs. The plots were measured, each with an English rod of 16.5 feet. There will be a small test in mental arithmetic coming up. The 5.5 yard English rod was integrated into the design, which called for a 1.5 rod plot. And you don't have to be told that that makes 24 foot 9 inches. Measured on the ground, however, the boroughs seem to have plots that measure 25 foot 6 inches wide. Where does the odd 9 inches come from? Well, between each plot was a ploughed furrow defining the edge boundary of the plot. And that 9-inch furrow was added to the 24 foot 9 inches. And the measuring that we have done suggests that this 25 foot 6 inch standard was established in every single one of the 7 boroughs right the way through Moray. This is planning on a big scale. Each borough was endowed with huge acreages of land. Where did that land come from? It was the expropriated land of the Moray nobility. This is colonial planning. The borough plantation was dovetailed into the ecclesiastical landscape so that each borough was the centre of a parish. So the parochial map is drawn up in tandem with the borough map, king and bishop working together in planning a landscape. This kind of planning does not smack of any sort of evolution. This is not some natural process. This is intelligent design. We've already seen that Elgin was particularly dignified with friaries and with a hospital to become a capital in this colonized landscape. This is your basic borough plan with the regular plots. In practice, there were variations because there were some 2-rod plots allocated to the most privileged burgesses. But this is the basic plan of all the Moray boroughs. They were probably designed by students of a chap called Maynard, who certainly laid out Barrett and probably St Andrews as well. He was a Fleming. They're always Flemings. So let's summarize. Moray's native rulers were killed generation by generation from 1130 to 1230. Native landholders were expropriated. Their land was reallocated to monasteries and to the boroughs. Burghal privileges and Burgess monopolies ensured that the Anglo-Normans of the coastal zone exerted cultural influence and economic control over the Gallic natives of upland Moray. English was the language of the boroughs. The inhabitants of the boroughs came from across the Norman world. Gallic natives were sucked into the Anglo-Norman commercial and linguistic world, and those who didn't were sidelined as an anachronistic irrelevance. Especially the precision of borough placement in the landscape, the meticulous precision of the borough's internal design and measurement epitomized the breadth and vision of the plan for civilizing the Kingdom of Moray. Now, my research mostly has focused on borough planning. I would like to see more research done on the planning of ecclesiastical landscapes and of landscapes of lordship, which I've only tentatively touched upon. But all of this, the radical redesign of Moray's landscape, was deliberate. It was colonization. It was a replacement of one elite by another elite. It was set in train by David, but not accomplished by David. He established a trajectory that was taken up by his grandsons, Malcolm and William, and largely completed under his great-grandson. There's one or two greats in it, Alexander II. We cited Aelred at the beginning of this paper, and I wonder whether Aelred was not archly demonstrating his classical knowledge by insinuating a parallel between contemporary events and the Roman conquest of Britain. The historian Tacitus describes how Agricola brought Roman culture to a barbarous people living in isolation and ignorance and therefore prone to fighting. That sounds like Moray, doesn't it? And his object was to accustom them to a life of peace. He therefore gave private encouragement and official assistance to the building of temples, public squares, and good houses. The population was gradually led into the demoralizing temptations of arcades and baths. The unsuspecting Britons spoke of such novelties as civilization, when in fact they were only a feature of their enslavement. I find it difficult not to misapply this directly to the Anglo-Norman transformation of Moray, inspired and set in train under David I. Thank you.